So in the final video for this week, I want us to think about the development of Christian asceticism and monasticism. This movement really arises out of the end of martyrdom in some ways. We have this transition from red martyrdom, the martyrdom of death, to this so-called white martyrdom, a martyrdom of asceticism and purification. What we discover in the 4th century as Christianity is becoming legalized and part of a broader culture is an organized monastic movement in places like Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Arabia. And so we see that there's this effort to move Christianity outside the structures of the institutional church as imperial power is legitimizing those sources of authority. In general, we find two forms of monastic life, and here I want to focus on Egypt, which is a real center for this. One is something we find in Lower Egypt, and this is known as eremetical monasticism, the monasticism of a hermit or someone who lives a solitary life. The prototype for this is Antony the Great, who lives as a hermit, and then there are groups of hermits that gather around a spiritual father, someone like an Abba, a spiritual father, or an Amma, a spiritual mother. And so we have a collection of sayings of the Desert Fathers, sayings of Abbas who taught those who had loosely gathered around them for instruction. And then in the region of Upper Egypt, we have something called cenobitic monasticism. Cenobitic comes from the word that means a common life together. And the monk Pachomius organizes this, and this is a more regular, organized form of monasticism that we're going to see popping up when we read the Rule of Benedict. And here we're looking at communities that are larger in scope, stable, and organized around patterns of work and prayer. Let's think about asceticism a little bit. Asceticism are practices of self-denial. And there are a whole range of ascetic practices that exist in this time period for Christians. Fasting, silence, celibacy, isolation, night vigils. The goal of ascetic practices is not self-denial for the purpose of self-denial, but rather a way of allowing the soul, allowing the inner self to be still and receptive enough to actually know what God is seeking to communicate, to be able to draw closer to God by stilling the other activities. This is tied into Greco-Roman notions of the importance of attaining equilibrium in order to create something known as an autarkic bodily system. Autarkic bodily system. Autarkic means self-sufficient or self-sustaining. This idea of creating a body that is self-sustaining and self-sufficient in a way so it needs very little energy or food intake, very little sleep, very little external stimulation, and so the body then can be stilled enough so that one's inner virtues, one's inner spirit can be more fully developed. For us contemporary people living in a hypersexualized context, the notion of embracing celibacy can seem quite strange. What's important to understand about celibacy is why it's seen as an appealing alternative to marriage. We live in a cultural context in which marriage is part of the expression of self-autonomy. However, in the ancient world, marriage was an institution bound up with the systems of the world and of family. You, especially if you're a woman, rarely had choice in whom you married. And even if you're a male, you're still often being compelled to enter into marriages that are beneficial for your family system. And so to escape marriage is to escape the demands of the world. To enter into marriage is to be bound up in all the things the world requires. And the desert then becomes this very appealing landscape to escape to, the place outside of civilization, and thus also a place to engage in spiritual warfare and the development of virtues, which are primary themes in early monastic literature. So with that, let's turn and look at the life of Antony. This is a text written by Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, in one of his periods of exile. Remember, Athanasius becomes the key proponent of Nicene orthodoxy after his successor, Alexander of Alexandria, dies. The life of Antony should not be read as a straightforward report or biography. Rather, it belongs to a genre we can call hagiography. That is, writings about holy people, writings about saints, the lives of saints. The purpose of hagiography is for Christians to better understand how to advance in the Christian life. And so the saint becomes an archetype for the Christian life. So let's look at two major themes here in the life of Antony. One is this way in which Antony, through his asceticism, is able to manifest the power of Christ. So as you read the text at the beginning, it's a story of how he renounces all of his worldly goods, and this leads to a conversion of life. One of the things that's important to know is that sometimes in Christian literature, when you read the word conversion, it doesn't mean moving from pagan to Christian, but can also often mean moving from being a baptized Christian to having a deeper faith commitment. So often there's a conversion narrative of the Christian going into the monastic life. That itself is a kind of conversion. We see in this story a narrative of how he gains victory over the devil through a whole variety of encounters with him that show how Christ's power now exists in Antony himself. And this culminates in chapter 14 of the life of Antony on page 136 of Coakley and Sterk on the bottom left column. I want to read this for you. And so for nearly 20 years, Antony continued training himself in solitude, never going forth and but seldom seen by any. After this, when many were eager and wishful to imitate his discipline, and his acquaintances came and began to cast down and wrench off the door by force, Antony, as from a shrine, came forth initiated in the mysteries and filled with the Spirit of God. Just read that text over again. Antony comes out as if from the Holy of Holies, having been initiated into deep mysteries, the mysteries of God. Then, for the first time, Antony was seen outside the fort by those who came to see him. And they, when they saw him, wondered at the sight, for he had the same habit of body as before. He was neither fat like a man without exercise, nor lean from fasting and striving with the demons. But he was just the same as they had known him before his retirement. So that's the autarkic bodily system showing forth there. And again, his soul was free from blemish, for it was neither contracted as if by grief, nor relaxed by pleasure, nor possessed by laughter or dejection. For he was not troubled when he beheld the crowd, nor overjoyed at being saluted by so many men. So his inner self and his outer self are both completely at equilibrium. But he was altogether even as being guided by reason and abiding in a natural state. Through him the Lord healed the bodily ailments of many present, and cleansed others from evil spirits. And he gave grace to Antony in speaking, so he consoled many that were sorrowful and set those at variance. At one, exhorting all to prefer the love of Christ before all that is in the world. Note how this is language here of Antony's nature, in a way, being fully restored. And from that, being able to then fully do the work of Christ, of reconciling people, healing them, and exhorting them to love one another. In another way, the power of Christ has thoroughly imbued him, and Antony is a new man, literally. That is, the old Adam has died, and a new Adam has shown forth in him. So as I note here, Antony is a kind of icon of redeemed humanity. This is showing how the Christology Athanasius holds, that Christ has come for us to transform us, to heal us and redeem us, shows forth in this complete transformation of the human person of Antony. Right? So we see a practical effect of Christology here then in the monastic literature. And so it gives us a really excellent way of thinking about how the holy is important and how the holy can then be experienced through holy men and also holy women. And so let's think about the life of Macrina as well. Just to note that up until this point, sources about women in early Christianity have been tricky to find. Generally, the best place we can find evidence about women in literary contexts is in letters to them. For instance, St. Jerome and St. Ambrose of Milan have some significant correspondences with circles of women who seek to learn from them. And biographies of women, like the life of Macrina, which is though actually kind of hagiography also. So we have to be careful not to think of it fully as a biography and ask the purpose of these texts also. It's very rare to find first-hand accounts from women themselves. Perpetua and Felicitas's martyrdom account, or the diary portion of that, is a significant exception. We have then both holy women and holy men, and there are differences between them. So holy women tend to show forth an inherited status and wealth, like Macrina, rather than this kind of independent achievement that we see in a person like Antony. They tend to be identified with cities, urban settings, not rural settings, and more often appear to be working in kind of a patronage model. Again, this is unlike Antony. The miracles they do appear to be less prominent. So what's more important in the story of Macrina is how she teaches and lives rather than the miracles she performs. And any ascetic actions they do all happen in these domestic household contexts. So you rarely have holy women going off into the wilderness pursuing asceticism, again like Antony, where they stay in a domestic context. But there's also some really significant similarities between holy women and holy men in this time period. One is that they appear to teach kinds of philosophy, kinds of Christian reasoning. And remember, philosophy is also about ways of living. They are champions and masters of asceticism. They can do the ascetic practices fully and deeply. And also, they can be great defenders of orthodoxy. And you see it's really coming through in Macrina's story as well. And so when we look at the story of Macrina, we see the story of a woman who is choosing to vigorously pursue the Christian life and finding spaces to do that in, given the limitations that the general society has for women. So it's helpful to read this in terms of her agency, Macrina's agency. But then we also have to remember that just like with the story of Antony, that Athanasius writes the story of Antony for his own purposes. Gregory writes the story of Macrina for his own purposes as well. So Macrina is also an ideal figure that helps Gregory talk about an ideal way to live the Christian life. Not all pursuers of asceticism, of course, are great saints. They are simply ordinary people striving after the holiness of life. And we can see this more ordinary pursuit of the ascetic life in something like the Rule of Benedict. The Rule of Benedict was a monastic rule composed by Benedict of Nursia in the 5th century that builds off of earlier monastic rules, and it really appears to be drawing from traditions that had developed around the figure of Pachomius that then gets distributed around the Mediterranean world. Benedict of Nursia lives in Italy, and he appears to be getting a lot of his conversation with monastic movements in southern France, which in turn had received monastic traditions from Egypt. There were many monastic rules circulating by the 6th and 7th century, and the Rule of Benedict comes to prominence especially in the 8th century when the Carolingians under Charlemagne take this up to regulate monastic life. We see in this rule the way in which military life is serving as a metaphor for monastic life. So the monastic life is a school of prayer, is the way the prologue describes it. And then also a place for training in spiritual warfare that becomes really significant as a metaphor in Germanic warrior cultures in the early Middle Ages in Europe. This gaining of spiritual arms and putting down the physical weapons. And so it's an important shift for nobility as they themselves in the early medieval period are having a shift from a warrior culture into a different kind of culture where they serve as spiritual patrons to monastic communities. And this military imagery in the Rule of Benedict also appears to also be helping to counteract notions of monks as effeminate, as not fully manly, in particular because women and female households have been great supporters and proponents of monastic communities. So there's really a lot happening in these movements. We want to just remember the ways in which the Rule of Benedict then becomes highly important into medieval Christianity and helps create a whole network of monastic communities that perhaps Benedict himself did not fully envision. Even into the 10th century, were the establishment of the monastery at Cluny, in which monks are given a kind of independence and prevention of interference from the nobility that then really supercharges the monastic movement throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. We've gone pretty far into this trajectory and moved into the early Middle Ages a little bit sooner than you perhaps might have expected. Part of this is I want to help you see how monasticism is a series of networks that moves across the Christian landscape, often independent of the official ecclesiastical structure of bishops and dioceses and parishes. Monasticism is its own kind of movement in Christianity and finds its own way. Well, that's all for our sessions this time. I hope you've learned a lot, and I look forward to our discussions.